So today we'll be talking about Chapter 1, Section 2. And the title of this is North American Societies Around 1492. Now, why do you think 1492 would be placed prominently here? What's the significance? The arrival of Columbus. You see, when Christopher Columbus arrived in the West Indies, we called them the West Indies because he believed he had arrived on he had believed he had arrived at India by sailing around the world. And so he called it the West Indies, believing that he had arrived at this popular trading destination. Well, of course, we know he found the New World. In fact, the North American continent, not just a few islands, but a giant land mass between India and Europe. But today we're going to continue talking about the people who lived there before this event. And though this event was certainly a change, and though it certainly reflected a great period in history of when Europeans began to colonize and where America began to form, but as we know, there were people living there long, long before. And so today we're going to learn about some of those cultures. And the first one is a group of people living in California, known as the Kashaya Pomo. Kashaya Pomo. These people that lived along the northwestern coast and today what is Northern California, Oregon, and Washington, made their way of life by hunting waterfowl. Also in California were peoples called the Yurok and the Hoopa. And they were gatherers, gathering acorns from trees, fishing in streams. And so like we were discussing Friday, when the earth began to warm, smaller animals began to thrive in the warmer climates, and humans were able to hunt these smaller animals. With a greater abundance of wildlife, the population of the world began to increase, and we began to see a more diversity of cultures and peoples. Now, along the northwest coast, we see many large communities. Many of these were living along waterways because, like the more ancient civilizations and communities and peoples settled in river valleys where there would be an abundance of fresh water and a variety of animals to live on. So the necessity of these early peoples were the basics of life. They had to live near fresh water. They had to live near sources of food. Many of these people settled along the coast as well, such as the Kwakiutl, the Nootka, and the Haida, living along the coast of California, or what is today California. They made their living hunting fish, even large creatures like whales and otters and seals. We have evidence of these people from many artifacts they created in worship, such as totems, which were symbols of ancestral spirits, ceremonial masks, the boats they used to fish, and the poles they would use to navigate shallow waterways. We have many artifacts from these peoples. We even have evidence that they had used a popular custom of the time among Native Americans, and that is the potlatch ceremony, where families would give away possessions in special ceremonies as symbols of their wealth. And we see this simply because of a diversity of artifacts among many communities. So evidence of these communities giving their artifacts to other communities as either symbols of peace or exchanges of loyalty or even objects of worship. Now in the southwestern United States, around 1300, the Pueblo were settling near waterways. And they had built these amazing homes out of clay. Now, the southwestern United States, like we discussed the other day, is a very dry region. And it's quite amazing these people were able to survive. But since it was so dry, they had to build dwellings out of what they had available. There was an abundance of dry dirt. And as you know, mixed with water and other minerals under certain conditions, that can be made into mortar. And the Pueblos excelled at this building skill. Now the Hopi and the Acoma lived near cliffs often for safety. And they excelled at developing irrigation systems to grow their crops. Many of the crops we have found among these Hopi settlements are corn, beans, squash, and we even find evidence of complex structures, underground ceremonial rooms where important events would take place. Now in the eastern woodlands, there were tribes like the Iroquois. In fact, when the United States had become a nation, the Iroquois had formed a confederation called the Iroquois League, had fought several significant battles against early American armies. But these people lived along the east coast of what is today the United States. They lived in farming settlements, but many continued the hunting and gathering ways of life as well. In these communities, we have found many different tools for working with objects made out of wood. In the Northeast, the peoples living there relied often on domesticated animals for food and clothing. In the Southeast, where rainfall is abundant, as we've seen this week, and where temperatures are much warmer, large farming operations were more feasible, even among these primitive peoples. Now, trade is one of the biggest factors in bringing tribes into contact. Trade has always been one of the most effective ways of spreading culture and religion, because this peaceful exchange of goods requires people from different ways of life to interact with one another for their mutual benefit. Trade also allows people to specialize in making certain goods. The early hunter-gatherers were nomadic, and they had to travel, and they had to spend most of their days in basic survival. They were not allowed to specialize because they didn't have time. They were always going from place to place. They made very few things. We have no forms of writing from that period because no one developed the skill. And we don't know much about their way of life except for what we can find from archaeology. However, these settled communities begin to develop complexities due in large part to trade. For example, these groups specialized in processing or making different products. So you could be a potter, and you could make a clay pot, and you could trade that clay pot for 2 or 3 days worth of food. Well, it might have only taken you a few hours to make that clay pot. However, you might be the only one who excels at that craft. And so you can trade those items for food. Other people might be warriors, and they might pledge to protect your community. And they might do that in exchange for food. Also, trade allows groups from other communities to network. And this requires a greater level of sophistication, written language, currencies, organizations, safety. With trade, with agriculture, we begin to see government. Now, many Native American groups, if you are interested in the study of primitive man, it is a fascinating subject. And though what we know about primitive man is less than what we know about more recent time periods, we have found a common theme among primitive cultures. Their religion tends to be animistic, meaning a worship of the elements, a worship of things they did not necessarily understand. The sun appears prominent in most primitive religions. Death appears prominent in most primitive religions. Water and the sea are often personified in myths. And land. Think of Gaia, Mother Earth, among some of the primitive cultures. The earth itself was worshipped. And many of these people revered the land they lived on. And some cultures did not necessarily settle or dwell in certain places. They moved from place to place. Many even continue to do so today. And so many of these cultures did not view land as an item to be sold. Religious beliefs. I got ahead of myself, and I've already told you some of this, but many of these primitive people's common theme, generalizing here worldwide, is that nature is filled with spirits. And so with so little understanding of death, many people believed that someone's spirit continues to exist after their death and guides the living in some way. There were some of these native cultures that were monotheistic. I don't remember which group of people, but there was one Native American tribe that revered a supreme being called Mahra. They believed that was the one God. But most were polytheistic, meaning they believed that various gods dictated the weather, the sun, the earth, the sea, the waterways. Now, what united these peoples? Well, again, we have to use a little bit of inference and think about what unites anybody. But these early societies were often based on family relationships. And we can even learn about some of these primitive groups by studying primitive tribes that still exist today. There are stateless societies living in many remote parts of the world. These stateless societies have no form of government. They're united purely by family ties of kinship. They pass down customs and cultures from family to family. We see evidence in these primitive cultures of a division of labor. Tasks associated by gender, age, and social status. And even with no formal system of government, this creates an orderly way of life. And so many of these settlements, again, very small farming communities, generally consist of a handful of families. And the tragedy of this harsh time was that with a scarcity of farmable land and the difficulty of cultivating soil and producing edible crops, the need for defense was extremely important. And so these families would unite together to protect themselves from outside forces.